My party's divided, but my party's also rational. If they can't get every single thing they want, but all that they have in the bill that before them is good, are they going to vote no? I don't think so.
Fox News Chief Washington correspondent Mike Emanuel is back in the house. Our two-time returning champion joins us again. Mike and Nick on the podcast. Thank you again for joining us, Mike.
Gentlemen, always a pleasure.
So, Mike, we want to get into some news and notes, like we mentioned off air. A bunch has been happening with the Supreme Court rulings. I kind of want to go through each one individually because a couple of them are very, very interesting, specifically around freedom of speech. There's one around the NCAA rulings, which we'll touch on, and then the Obamacare. Let's start with that one first. In your opinion, of these three Supreme Court rulings, which one was kind of shocking to you, and in terms of the court making a decision leaning one way or the other?
I thought Obamacare was fascinating because conservatives have been trying to kill Obamacare for 10 years, basically. It's been a promise Republicans have made to voters over and over again. You elect us, we will get rid of Obamacare. Well, it's interesting. You have a 6-3 conservative majority right now. And yet, two of the people that were appointed by President Donald J. Trump voted with the liberals to uphold Obamacare. And so I found that fascinating because in Washington, after President Trump selected Amy Coney Barrett to fill the slot held by the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think a lot of Democrats were freaked out thinking, like everything's gone out the window that Democrats hold near and dear to their hearts. Well, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, two of President Trump's nominees, now justices, sided with the liberals. And so I think that was interesting. And it wasn't just pure partisanship. It was who had the better constitutional legal argument, and they sided with the liberal side. So Obamacare lives. It's been tested time and time again. And on one of the big Supreme Court cases, Chief Justice John Roberts actually saved Obamacare in a previous term. This time it was interesting to see, I think, what the Trump judges did. And 2 out of the 3 went with the liberals. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating.
On the subject of like where assumptions we make about partisanship and court rulings, this also brings to mind the recent case about the city of Philadelphia against that foster care agency. I believe it was foster care. I believe it was like a 9-0 decision in favor of the agency against the city of Philadelphia. What are these cases telling us about? And you mentioned the 6-3, quote unquote, and I'll say quote unquote because the rulings don't seem to necessarily go along with what our assumptions are about party lines and such. But what is it telling us about maybe what we're perhaps getting wrong about our assumptions about the Supreme Court and how it's operating and how it's endemic of what we think are just decisions and their ramifications?
I think it may be refreshing, to be honest, that in this hyper-partisan town of Washington, D.C., that maybe they're tuning out a lot of the noise. Maybe they're really back there in their chambers with their smart clerks, going through case by case and looking at the legal arguments and saying, it's not what I believe personally, it's about the Constitution, it's about the law. And I think they also, as institutionalists, probably want to make sure that it does not look like they are rubber stamping one side or the other, or, totally predictable based on partisanship. And so I think, they as justices wearing those black robes, not red team or blue team, I think feel very strongly that they have an institution to protect. They've been given lifetime contracts. And so why not do the best you can based on the law? You don't have to answer to a president. You're around longer than the president, as long as you stay healthy. So I think it's fascinating because things are so hot and so hyper-partisan in Washington, D.C., and yet that big, beautiful building, the Supreme Court, perhaps inside, they're able to tune it out, do what they need to do. And, at the end of June, how they stack up, how the cases finally stack up. And, we've been watching very closely to see what the first term with Amy Coney Barrett on the high court would mean. Would she be reflexively a conservative, or would she be unpredictable? And I think so far, we'll see the final report card at the end of the month, but I think so far she's been interesting to watch, as have some of the other justices as well.
Mike, I know you're big into college sports. Obviously, the three of us share Rutgers University and the passion for that school. And I mentioned the Supreme Court ruling about the NCAA. Tell us a little bit more about what the Supreme Court ruled on in that case. And do we see some more challenges coming that could break up, the antitrust laws that the NCAA has been hiding behind for years?
I don't know if you guys, when you went to Rutgers, knew athletes, but I know back in the day that a lot of the guys we went to school with, the rules were so strict in terms of what they could be given by the school. And so my understanding is that this opens up a lot of opportunities. And so more educational benefits. If you are an athlete and you want to go study overseas, go study abroad or something like that, the university can provide enhanced benefits. And so I think a lot of people see this as starting the liberation of college athletes who we know produce billions of dollars in some cases for the NCAA, for the TV networks and others, or their institutions, millions of dollars for their institutions, whether it's the NCAA football playoff or March Madness. Obviously, some of the other sports don't create quite the revenue, but I think this is seen as an opportunity that they're being liberated. And I know one of the guys at Rutgers, Geo Baker, a point guard on the team, was very vocal about that college athletes should be able to take advantage of their platform and make a few bucks, have a few bucks in their pockets to go get a pizza or do whatever they want to do. Obviously, we know that athletes, their shelf life in terms of their careers is not typically very long. And so they've been fighting hard to get more opportunities while they're on the Big Ten network or on an SEC network or, on ABC, CBS, or ESPN, seeking more opportunities to make a few bucks for themselves. And, in a lot of these sports, at least football, we know they're a hit away potentially from their careers being over. And so, why not have a college star being able to, if they're bringing in big dollars and people are wearing their jerseys all over town, let them make a few bucks. And so some people are suggesting that this may be the chipping away at the NCAA's absolute power when it comes to these athletes.
Shifting gears to what you're seeing actually in DC right now with on the policy scene, currently with or not so much policy, but what we're seeing with the current administration with bills trying to get passed. Recently, we're seeing for the People's Act, like where it is in the Senate. What's been your temperature as far as, and you mentioned before, hyper-partisan being your word about DC. Yeah. What's your take of where these different bills are? What are the prospects of legislation getting passed and things like that?
The latest I've heard is a kind of a hopeful note on infrastructure, which we've been hearing for years is something both parties would love to do. There was some thought that the builder, former President Trump, would jump on an infrastructure plan, that it would be something that he'd love to sign and to, create all these things that could go on for decades after his presidency. It didn't get done. And so now a lot of people are thinking, you've got a 50-50 Senate. You've got a very closely divided House of Representatives. Yes, Democrats are in charge of the town, but basically the legislation to get across the finish line, it would be a lot easier if you could get some Republican buy-in. And so we know that prominent Republicans, Democrats in the Senate and the White House have been meeting. They've been talking about ways they could get things done. We're hearing very hopeful things at last report. We'll see where it goes in terms of getting legislation across the finish line, but it would seem to be that, improving the nation's highways, bridges, tunnels would be something that everybody could get on board with. There's been some bickering about how you pay for it. Republicans have talked about repurposing some of the COVID relief money that maybe wasn't spent. There's been some discussion about the possibility of, and we're Northeastern guys originally, tolls. But I think there are a lot of folks who think that may hit the little guy more. And so maybe you don't want to do tolls. So it sounds hopeful. It sounds like they are getting to a framework. If they could get at least some buy-in from both parties, then that would certainly make it a lot easier to get to President Biden's desk for his signature. In this town, it's not done till it's done. If they present that framework to their conferences and say, here's what we got, and one side or the other says, heck no, we're not doing that, then it could be back to the drawing board. But I think if you have the president on board and top leadership in the Senate and the House on board, then I think it's looking pretty good. I would think this could be something they should get done. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but it's been challenging in this town recently. And a lot of folks in this town basically say, well, if I'm a Democrat and the Republicans like the deal, well, then maybe I shouldn't like it that much. Like these days, there doesn't seem to be a lot of this deal could be good for both sides. It's either I win and you lose, or you win and I lose. And that makes it tough to get things across the finish line. So my guess is that infrastructure could hopefully get done. And we'll see. There could be some bumpy days ahead, but they sound hopeful at the moment.
Mike, one of the big shifts from President Biden from former President Trump was really about America first. And when Biden went overseas recently, President Biden talked about, returning to working with allies, specifically like England and France. What do you make of President Biden's trip out to Europe and the relationships that he's built with some of the other world leaders?
Well, I think a lot of the allies felt a lot more comfortable with him. I think they've gotten to know him over the years. He 8 years as President Obama's vice president, so he was well known from that. Some of the ones who've been around a long time may know him from when he was on the Foreign Relations Committee in the United States Senate, and so they may go way back with him. And so I think the body language from the allies was comfortable. Because I think if you look back at former President Trump's term, he was a disruptor. He was a disruptor on a lot of things in Washington. He was also a disruptor in terms of things like NATO and saying to allies, you need to pay more to protect the alliance. This should not all be on the United States' taxpayers' backs. And so the body language seemed to be that the allies were pretty comfortable, somebody they know, somebody they trust. And, for the sake of the country, let's hope it's a successful relationship going forward, because he is our commander in chief.
Turning to just thinking about education as another sphere, I know recently there was a piece you had done around critical race theory and just for lack of a better phrase, the controversy around it, which, just my personal aside is there's a lot of misinformation floating around about it. But in your reporting, what was some of the things that just came up, some of the things you were learning?
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time in Loudoun County, Virginia. It's a Washington, D.C. suburb, upscale, lovely community, good schools, great homes, nice neighborhoods. And I've talked to a lot of parents who are concerned because they do think that the curriculum has shifted some. That some of the books that are being sent home with their kids are different. And look, I cannot 100% say that the curriculum has changed. All I can tell you is I've talked to parents who are concerned about that. I was at a school board meeting where it was hot on both sides. And so there's that issue. And then there's also a transgender policy issue, which are two red hot issues in this Washington, D.C. suburb. And people are fired up. And it's interesting because, I think in a lot of communities, the school board meeting is like a snoozer and nobody turns out. But there were 259, I think, signed up to speak at the last Loudoun County school board meeting. And they cut it off after 51 speakers because things got really hot in the room. So, look, I think it's an emotional topic. I think there are a lot of people who think that there are ways to incorporate some of this into academics. But some of the parents I talked to just sounded like some of the books that were being put in the classroom may have had some language that they thought was inappropriate. Some of them felt like it was causing children who may not see color as young kids to see it, and perhaps feel guilty if their ancestors were Anglo, and perhaps feel like they were mistreated if they were African American. And I know this is very much a hot button issue, so I'm not taking a position here, but it's emotional. And I think a lot of teachers feel like, they're in a tough spot because people are very fired up on both sides, both the critical race theory issue and the transgender issue. And it's certainly going to be something to watch. I think a lot of parents are very engaged and wondering how it's going to play out over the summer. And I know Loudoun County is planning a vote in August on the transgender policy. And so we'll see how it plays out. We'll leave it to the parents and the school system out there to figure it out.
Mike, one thing that seems to have taken a back burner, which I'm pretty shocked at because we keep seeing a rise in gun violence across the country. But what are you hearing in DC? I know you just alluded to it earlier about how tough it has been in terms of making or getting bipartisan support on legislation. But what are you hearing in terms of any type of gun legislation that's coming down the pike? Anything that's being proposed right now in the House or the Senate?
I'm not hearing much of anything at the moment, to be 100% candid, 100% honest. I know every time there's one of these devastating mass shootings, there's a lot of talk. And then as the weeks and months go by, maybe they realize it's a difficult issue because the two parties are dug in potentially different areas. So right now, I'm not hearing a whole lot of anything. And maybe it's as simple as with this tight of a divide in the Senate and the House, it may be too difficult to get something across the finish line. If 4 or 5 Democrats from rural districts basically say they're not going to support something because maybe they're in rural districts, and no Republicans support it, then it's doomed. In the Senate, to get much of anything done, you really need 60 votes in favor. So that would mean typically 10 Republicans to go on board with the Democrats. And so, I'm not hearing much of anything going on at the moment on that issue right now.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up that about the 60 votes. It seems that I'm not even going to create a straw person here. I'm just going to use myself. But, as a result of the recent election in 2020, when we saw, 2 senators emerge from Georgia as Democrats, suddenly you're looking at a 50-50 split in the Senate, with the deciding vote being the vice president, whose the formal title was president of the Senate, in Vice President Kamala Harris. But as you're saying, and we're becoming more familiar with that concept of 60 votes, the filibuster, pieces like that, Mike and I like to refer to this as a literacy moment. Mike, just kind of putting you on the spot from a poli-sci standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
How has the conversation shifted? Like, why have we gone away from the Democrats had that 51, that could have been the majority, to now really actually need 60?
Well, that's been the tradition and in the United States Senate. And the thought was that the House with 435 would pass things by simple majority. And then when they got to the Senate, that would be kind of the cooling saucer to basically hash out the ideas, see if you can get the other side to come aboard, maybe do a little horse trading. I'll give you some of this, you give me some of that. We get a compromise deal across the finish line. And so much of the past, decade or so has felt like, again, if your side wins, then my side loses. And so maybe I'd rather get 0% of a deal than to look like I lost. And so it's been really, really tough. And, I think the 2022 election may sort out whether President Biden gets a larger majority and maybe it's a little easier for him to get his agenda through. Or if there's a Republican Senate and or a Republican House, it may be a couple of years of gridlock, or they may sit at the negotiating table and maybe they can cut some deals. So, there are those who would say when you've got divided government, there's a great opportunity for doing some big things. But everybody has to be a willing partner at the table. And so I guess we'll just see how it plays out.
Mike, thank you so much again for coming on the program. 1:00 on Sundays, Fox News Live. Mike Emanuel does a great job for all the stories. You can check him out or check out foxnews.com and type in Mike Emanuel, and you can see all the recent stories that he's done. We appreciate you coming on the program again, Mike. Thank you, and all the best. Continued success, sir.
My pleasure. Have a great summer and keep doing great things, guys.